a lot of error in all these data. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it. But I'm going to try to take it seriously and tell you what I think we can derive from all these data. I do a lot of stuff also on the international tests. If you want to see our take, Richie Rostings and my take on international tests, we published a paper back in January, quite a long paper, looking carefully. And I'm going to bring some of that kind of analysis into the type of analysis we did into what the position of California. So here's what I'm going to talk to you about today. As I mentioned, as part of this longer-term project to see about the rhetoric and misuse of national and student test score data to understand what is really happening in U.S. education and what is working or not. So, first of all, everything I tell you today is preliminary and subject to revision. I did this for this particular presentation, but as part of a longer-term project about what's happening in across the country. Right off the bat, I can tell you there's tremendous variation between U.S. states, tremendous variation. And I'm going to try to place California in that pack of variation. And so first thing I'm going to do is compare California students' scores on the 8th grade math in 2013 to the NAEP national average and to Massachusetts and Texas. Now, why Massachusetts and Texas? Because Massachusetts and Texas are two different kinds of states, but they're both very high scoring on the NAEP, okay? And so I'm going to try to see where California sits next to them. I'm going to compare it to the national average as well, and and then I'm going to adjust those California scores for the demographic difference with the nation as a whole and Massachusetts and Texas to see if there's some kind of correction. Now, I hadn't done this as of Wednesday, but I was sitting, I liked, ever since the old days when we worked, old days, the 1970s, when we worked on workstations rather than personal computers, and we were tied to a mini computer, and you didn't have a workstation in your office. You might, but it would be rare. So you had to go to a place to work on the workstation. So I'd go over to the computer center at Stanford, and I'd sit at my workstation. And of course, you're sitting with a lot of other people around you, and so I got used to that. So people find it strange. I sit in this big lobby where all the students hang out at Stanford, and I do my work. People say, how can you work here? I said, I just got used to it. I got used to working with a lot of noise around me. It helps me to focus. But the danger is that I ran into Mike Kirst as he was walking across there. So I said, Mike, come and look at this. Come and look at my slides here. I'm going to present them up at Sacramento at the PACE seminar. So he looks at my slides, and we get sort of into it, and he said, all of a sudden he says, I don't want to know any of this, and they don't want to know any of this. What they really want to know is, why is California 45th? And so you should, and all these states are ahead of us. So how much of that is due to social class differences and race and ethnicity differences? Well, okay, so it took me another 4 hours to figure, and almost stressed out completely. Came home to my wife, and she started beating up on me. She said, you shouldn't be doing this anymore. Anyway, so I will present that to you. And then I'm going to compare California students of similar ethnic and family resource backgrounds to students in other large states, New York, Florida, Illinois, and Texas, because they're comparable states. And then I'm going to try to make some conclusions using various other data. So, first of all, let me just say this, that test scores are all too often referred to as reflecting the quality of educational systems. However, you may all know this, but even many people in the press don't seem to understand this, that they're also the results of inputs that have little to do with the quality of formal education. These include family and state inputs like preschool, healthcare, secure environments, before and during the school years. It includes peer inputs, and it also includes a historical self-perception of groups holding quite different views of their academic and social possibilities, which have been ingrained in them and constantly reinforced by the nature of inequality in our society. So controlling for these extra school inputs helps us get a better idea of differences in student performance. And then we can begin discussing what part of what's left over is really due to schools. But usually what happens is you see a test score, you compare it with another country or another state, and you say, oh, that's the school system. Well, that's wrong. We have no idea what part of that is the school system. We really don't. And to identify it as the school system, and they're very smart people doing this, and I believe that they know this, and they use this for whatever reason they're using it for. And I think we have to constantly be telling them, you cannot do this. You can't do it for a lot of reasons. You can't do it because it's wrong just in principle from an analytical point of view, and it may cause you to make very bad decisions if you believe it's true. So we have to combat that, and so part of my presentation is going to be talking about that. So we're going to present student performance over time by state and race and ethnicity, but this doesn't, I thought I corrected this misspelling, it doesn't necessarily control for all family and state inputs, nor does it necessarily capture everything about school inputs. So everything's an approximation. So now how do I define family academic resources? This is another thing. You may or may not care about this, but it's important because in the international comparisons we use books in the home. And we've had a lot of, I would say, reaction to that. Paul Peterson called me a bad Marxist because I use books in the home instead of income. But the fact is that income doesn't actually, is not a very good predictor, it's much worse than books in the home, of academic performance. And you might ask why. So I always use the following anecdote. I walk into an apartment in Moscow of my colleague, who is a very eminent and well-paid professor at a big university, and is also an advisor to the Minister of Education. So there's lots of opportunities to earn money, etc. He lives in an apartment which by US standards is tiny. There's very little stuff in the apartment. I mean, the television set is circa 1990, I would say. If you look around, you'd say, this is kind of a lower middle class family, except for one thing. Every wall is covered with books. And if you wanted to use as a predictor of how well their children do in school, would you use the size of the apartment, what they have in the apartment, or would you use the books? Well, it's obvious you'd use the books. I mean, the books convey something about what those kids, how well those kids are going to do well in school. So I think if you think about it, now people argue, well, books, nobody reads books anymore. And that may be true in 20 or 30, I would say in 20 years, but it's not true today. The fact is that people who have books have a lot of books particularly, or people who have very few books. That is a very good measure of family academic resources. It's also a good measure from another standpoint, and that is that there's a lot of validity and very few missing answers on the questionnaires. Remember, we're asking teenagers to answer these questions. That's who's answering the questions on these questionnaires. And the question is, I'm going to use mother's education with the NAEP because the books in the home variable they don't even really start it until 2003. But mother's education has a problem because, even though I'm using it, because if you look down the list of how many people didn't answered I don't know, it's in some states it's almost as high as 30% don't answer that question. And that's true on international tests as well. So if you start using this, you're missing 15 to 30% of the answers. And you can correct for that statistically But the second thing is there's a lot of error in it. A long time ago, I asked brothers and sisters in the same schools, teenagers, this question about various questions about their parents, and the validity of brothers and sisters in the same school. If you just cross-tabulated that, the only thing that worked, that was highly valid, was articles in the home or books in the home, because they both saw that. They just don't know their parents' education. If you look at the international tests, I mean, you have wild answers. Brazil, 2003, 30% of the answers say parents have university complete on the PISA test. I mean, in the 1980s, when their parents went to school, these are their mothers, less than 11% of people went to university. So, I mean, these are wildly bad answers. So there's a danger in even using that classification. The second measure we use is race ethnicity, and together the percentage of whites, Asian Americans, and the percentage of students reporting a mother's education as college graduate, if you run just those two variables across the states, just the percentage of whites plus Asian Americans, and whites, I'll refer to whites as white non-Hispanics, and the percentage of students reporting mother's education college grad, those two variables alone, just those two variables, explain 55% of the variance in NAEP test scores across states. Okay, just those two. So here are the test scores, the 8th grade math U.S. long-term trends. And you can see that everybody went up, and particularly starting in the early 70s, in the mid-70s, and up to the late 80s, blacks and Hispanics made tremendous gains relative to whites. Okay? I won't go into, there are lots of papers written about why that happened, but it has nothing to do with schooling, by the way. So, that's the good news. Anyway, but they all go up. They all go up. What?
Which color is which?
Oh, I'm sorry. Red is Hispanic, black is green, and white is black.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, you can't see that. It is down. Hard to see. Move up. Come on. So anyway, so you can see that they're gains. So that's important. If people tell you that there's been no advancement in the quality of U.S. education, just point them to this graph. And even in 8th grade reading, in recent years, there have been, early on, for blacks and Hispanics, the same, and even in recent years, since, the late 90s, there have been gains, smaller than in math. Reading is a much more of a, I'm afraid, particularly by the 8th grade, it's pretty hard to affect reading scores, and yet they seem to be going up a little bit. Okay, so here's what Mike Kurtz wanted me to show you. I don't think you will. Other people have said nobody can understand this table, but let me just make it clear. This is California, just to give you an example. California, this is by people who answered that their mothers had less than high school complete than high school complete, some post-secondary, and college grad. Okay, so let's look at California, Massachusetts, just to give you an example. So you can see that in California, of the students in 2013, who's in the 8th grade, they answered, 18% of them answered that their mothers had less than high school education. In Massachusetts, it was 9. In going up to the other extreme, it's 40% or 41% in California, say college graduates, and in Massachusetts, 58. By the way, these percentages are of those who answered the question. Okay, I took out the I don't knows. So these are big differences at top and bottom, right? So these are different states from a sort of family academic resource standpoint. On the question of white, black, Latino, again, the differences are enormous. 71% of Massachusetts is white non-Hispanic versus 32% in California. These are in schools, in 8th grade, not the population. And then both about 7% black, Latino 48% in California versus 13% in Massachusetts, and Asian Americans about twice as high a percentage in California. So these are the two axes of what we're going to do to correct scores. And so just to show you what you do, that even when you correct, I corrected to the national average, assuming that California had the national average on both of these variables, on both of them. So I did the same table for the nation as I just showed you, and then did a simulation and said, let's say I weighted the California scores in these boxes. In each of these boxes there's a score. Let's say I weighted them by the national average. California scores go up relative to the national average. Cuts about half the distance, okay? Because California is on average, lower social class, more ethnically diverse state than the national average. And the ethnic diversity points to lower scores, except in one case, that's the Asian Americans. California is way above average on the Asian Americans. So they score very high on average, so it offsets part of the other part. We have fewer African Americans. African Americans, as you saw, score lower than Latinos or Hispanics. And in Texas, however, if we do the adjustment, California actually comes worse off because we have more Asian Americans and fewer African Americans, and but a similar social class. So we get actually penalized compared to that. We do worse if we look like Texas than we do. As far as Massachusetts is concerned, we get a huge gain relative to Massachusetts, but there's still a lot left that's not explained by the simulation. So theoretically, you should say this part is what's not explained by race class. This part is what's not explained by race class, and this part is not explained by what's race, family, academic resources, or class. Okay? Is that clear? So there's something, I don't want to just call it schooling, but schooling is in there, that we're still not the same, even when we make these corrections. So if we do this with TIMSS, I don't know if you can see this. This is the Trends in International Math and Science, 2011. Okay? So here, California happens to be one of the states that took it. Here's California. So this is divided by books in the home, a better variable to measure family academic resources and mother's education. No racial breakdown here. So I want to point out two things. First of all, if you look at the people who reported more than 200 books in the home, okay, pretty good. And by the way, big differences between top and bottom in every state. In fact, in Massachusetts, the differences are actually quite larger than in Alabama, one of the lowest scoring states. So differences between top and bottom doesn't mean bad, because if you're living in Massachusetts and you're in the bottom group, you're scoring the same as a student in Alabama who's in the top group. Where would you rather be if you were a low family academic resource person? And would you rather be, in terms just of test scores, you'd be indifferent whether you were in Alabama or Massachusetts to trade with a person who has high academic resources. Now, what that means, my hit is, one of the reasons is that Alabama has a terrible school system and Massachusetts has a good one. I'm more confident saying that than simply comparing the average score. When I look at this, I'm more confident, not completely confident, but more confident. That means that a child of a these are, by the way, public and private together. So, I mean, it's just not public schools, it's all schools. So, now, here's a more telling example. Let's look at Massachusetts versus neighboring state Connecticut. What's interesting about this, as I'll show you later, Connecticut and Massachusetts back in the 1990s, even as late as 99, were the same on the TIMSS. The same average. Look what's happened today. At every level, Massachusetts scores a lot higher than at the top. People in Connecticut don't look very different coming from this group than the people in Massachusetts. But this is a standard deviation higher. I'm sorry, a third of a standard deviation higher. On the NAEP, it's a standard. It's a third of a standard deviation higher, which is huge in terms, and it's at every level. This on another test. It's related to the NAEP. Now, where's California? California is relatively low. Under the states that took this test, the only state that's lower across the board is Alabama. North Carolina, not exactly an all-white state of high social class. Look where they score compared to California. Half a standard deviation higher. At just about the third of a standard deviation here, the third there, but at the top a half, at the bottom a third of a standard deviation. So we're heading somewhere now. The other thing is, now we're going to start looking at gains. We're looking at cross-section so far, but look at gains. The trouble is, you got to be careful about one thing, and I'll show you this. If you start out low on the test, lately there's been in the news that DC has made these huge gains on the last NAEP, but DC is near the bottom. Now they've made gains, by the way, since the 1990s, big gains. But they've made such big gains and they're so low that I didn't even put them on this graph. But they're up here somewhere, very high. But when you're a low-scoring state, you're going to make higher gains automatically. It's called regression to the mean. Okay, it doesn't happen for every state equally, but because there's some low-scoring states that don't do very well. But even this state, I don't remember which one it is, generally will make bigger gains than almost every state in this range. Now, these states down here, these are Nebraska, Iowa, some very high-scoring states that have made negative gains over this period. So here's Texas, and I believe California is this. Yeah, California's here and Texas is here. Okay, so these are gains. Now let me show you more accurately what's going on with the NAEP. So these are, we're going to take the racial, ethnic, and mother's education out of the gains. And so I'm comparing here with the 5 large states, population states. Here's California, okay? Here's Texas, this is Florida, Illinois, New York. This is 8th grade math for non-Hispanic whites who reported high school complete or less for their mothers. They came from homes with mother's education, high school or less. So we're sort of, we started out about the same. We had a bad period here before we put the standards in. Standards hit finally. I'm not saying the standards did it, I'm just saying historically, that's what happened. So we started making gains. Now, this is for a group, a lower family academic resource, but relatively high scoring ethnic group. And if you compare it to the other states, New York had a big jump and then leveled off, and we eventually caught up. The same happened with Illinois and Florida for this group. Texas, on the other hand, continued to go up, and they started out the same as we did in 1990, and now even with the recent drop, in the last NAEP, they still score a lot higher than we do. And now, this is for the same family academic resources, but for Latinos. I'm not going to go into African Americans, it just takes too long, and our African American population is relatively small. But here is the big group in California. Now, there's danger in looking at this because Latinos, there's a lot more diversity in the Latino community across states than in the non-Hispanic whites or Anglo community. So, but we're about the same as New York. We sort of again caught up with some of these states. New York is almost flat. There's a completely different Hispanic community, mainly Caribbean, Puerto Rican, Dominican, and we're very heavily Mexican American. And Florida has a lot of Cubans in it, but you can see that they flattened out. We continue to go up. Texas continues to go up. Their community looks a lot more like ours, except the immigrant portion of that may not be the same. We have more new immigrants coming into California than Texas does. So given that, you can see there's more variation across the states, but again, Florida taking account of the fact that there's a bunch of high-scoring Cubans in here, that even with high school graduate or less, we're not so terrible compared to the other states except for Texas. Now, let's talk about for college graduates, other extreme. There's one group I didn't talk about, just some college education, but they behave similarly. First of all, for college graduates, California has bigger gains than for same group, same ethnic group, but high school graduates. I'll talk about that later. So we do relatively well with the more educated. Look, we're essentially the same as everybody. Illinois is a little bit higher than we are. These are small differences. Texas, actually, with this dip, if we went back to this year, they started out higher and they finished a little higher, but now we're back to where we started. So in terms of gains for this people with high family academic resources, compared to other big states, we're still lower than Texas. I'll talk about that. There might be some other variables here, but we're definitely better off with that group. And now we come to college educated Latinos who reported mother's education as college graduates, and these things are all over the map. It's a relatively smaller group than the other one that I talked about. But here, Texas, we don't do as well, although we've had big gains in recent years. The real loser here is New York, which seems to be all over the place and is flat. The other states are going up and down, and again, the difference with Texas is considerable. So let's talk about a little bit about this. So what's interesting about this is, I'll cut to the chase here, is that we did well with the gap between non-Hispanic whites with mother's education equal to high school or less, and those with mother's education equal to college graduate, was wider in 1990 in Texas than in California, and now is narrower. So they have narrowed the gap in Texas between groups with different family academic resources, and I'm sorry, this is very confusing. The gap between non-Hispanic whites with mother's education equal to high school graduate and those with mother's education equal to college graduate was wider in Texas than in California, is now somewhat narrower in Texas. So the gap increased in California but declined in Texas. So in terms of that one group, Texas has decreased the gap and California increased the gap. That means that exactly what I said before, that we've done better in California with the higher social class or higher family academic resource groups with whites than we did with the lower family academic resource groups. So our gap widened while in Texas it narrowed. Okay? On the other hand, with the difference between Hispanics and whites was larger in California in the beginning, and we decreased it more than in Texas. So between Hispanics and whites, we've decreased it more. The gap is still larger in California, but it's been a bigger decrease than in Texas. And in the Latinos with higher mother's education and lower mother's education versus whites, the gap was, with Hispanics and whites, the gap between the college graduate whites and Hispanics decreased less in California than in Texas. So on average, we have favored, in some sense over time, we've done better with the more favored groups relative to the less favored groups. The gaps actually increased somewhat for us, but lowered in Texas. Okay, so I can't explain exactly why, but so the evidence is mixed in terms of California doing a better job of equalizing test scores. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to do with schooling, by the way. There can be other reasons for this. It could be the way it's reported. I'll talk to you about exclusion rates, et cetera, other things that can enter into these measurements. So here's some initial speculations of why these differences exist. So can we say something about why the California schools educational system is not doing as well as other states, or whether students outside of school inputs may be different in other states? So non-Hispanic whites whose mothers graduated from college are most likely to be similar across the states. These other groups vary more. And the difference in the rise in math 8th grade scores for that group in the past 23 years has been similar in the 5 states. So in terms of increasing scores for that group, we're doing as well as any other state, even though the California scores remain significantly below the Texas scores, but not the other 3 states. And until 2011, the increase in Texas scores were greater than those in California. One possible explanation is that Texas has consistently excluded a higher fraction of special ed students from the test. However, remember, we're talking about changes across time, versus the gap. So in change across time, we wouldn't expect that California made a sudden change in 1998, 2000, in which they excluded fewer people from the test. Texas did not make that change.
Hi, my name is Eric Zilbert. I'm former NAEP California program. There are just a couple things about the measures between us and Texas that you have to be aware of. One, for a long time we had a much lower exclusion rate for the special ed in Texas.
I know.
Then they got straight. And so
they did get straight.
Yeah, they did get straight. They've come down quite a bit, much closer to our.
But it was quite a while ago, wasn't it? It was like in the early 2000s.
It's still not the same, but it's much better.
Yeah, but it changed when the test was modified, right?
And then, no, it was because NAEP started leaning on people.
I see.
To exclude. The other thing is that in Texas, they allow the bilingual booklet to be used for kids who don't speak English, and that's not an accommodation that we allow in this state. So there's a little bit of difference in the way that they're measured. And then the other consideration is that the proportion of English learners in both states have changed at different rates. So,
ours are larger, right? Ours have grown faster, right?
well, we've been declining, actually.
We've been declining.
The
And
proportion, yeah.
And what about them?
Grade, over time.
And what about Texas?
They declined it faster.
Even faster?
Yeah.
Okay. The interesting thing about what you said is that if Texas has in fact lowered their exclusion rate more, I mean, that the change was greater over this period than for us. That increase in Texas is even more impressive than it would be if they had done the opposite.
Correct.
So if that's the case, then we should say that there's something, that the difference between Texas and California is not based just on who's taking the test. It's based, there's something else in there. So that is an important point. Now, the whites reporting mother's education as high school graduates has smaller gains in California than in all the 4 comparison states, but larger gains than all but similar students in Texas after 2000. This pattern is similar but more pronounced than in the case of whites with mother's education college graduate. Possibly the implementation of the California standards and standard-based testing in 1998 could explain this pattern, possibly. However, it still would not explain why lower non-Hispanic white students in California score so much lower than the same similar students in Texas. Again, is this a result of higher Texas NAEP exclusion rates or a policy? It seems not. No, it could be that the schools in Texas are more effective. Could be. Okay? Should we consider that? States similar to ours in terms of the demographics, similar, not the same, but similar, and yet we have an advantage and they have we have an advantage of the higher advantage of a group of test takers who do very well. That's the Asian Americans, many more of them here than in Texas, and they have a disadvantage of a group of people that doesn't do as well on tests, even for the same socioeconomic background. African American students, they have many more of them. So altogether, if we just look at the white students, they do better. If we look at the Latino students, they do better. If they look at the black students, they do better. And they, by the way, do better for the Asian students too. So the question is, I think it's fair to ask why. I mean, Mike Hurst just hates me talking about Texas all the time, but the fact is that the comparison is a good one. When we compare with Massachusetts, we're really comparing apples to oranges. I mean, it's a very different kind of state, as I showed you the numbers. And if we look at Hispanics, tests depend on a lot of things. They can depend on immigrant status, language knowledge, percent of ELL students, and on subgroup self-perceptions, Cuban origin, Puerto Ricans, Mexican origin. In any case, if the ELL student exclusion rates differ, the level of scores could differ considerably. Now, I would say that one organizational difference between states is the strength of their accountability systems. The reason I'm just saying this is because we wrote a paper back in 2000 that showed, in the early 2000s, 2003, showing that accountability seemed to be significant in explaining interstate differences, particularly for African Americans. So we developed this measure in 2000. It rates states on the amount of testing they do, the reward sanctions connected with those performance evaluation. And in this case, California had, even at that time, post-98, had a high accountability as of 4. A number of states had 5, which was even higher. So what I do here is I compare some low accountability states, Arizona, Connecticut, and Michigan, we call weak accountability, with Maryland, Massachusetts, and North Carolina, to strong accountability. And there's a tendency for the strong accountability states to have bigger increases in math scores. So here are the weak accountability states. And I just want to show you that they go from about 265 in 1990, these are whites, I'm just doing it for this one group, up to about 280. And then if you look at these guys, this is Massachusetts, Maryland, and North Carolina, they also go from about 260 up to 290. So they increased by 10 points, which is a third of a standard deviation over this period, over the weak accountability states. It's a lot. Now, I ran a regression. I'm not going to bore you with this, but this is over the 1990, taking account of the 2 time periods, and 1990, 2000, and 2013. And it turns out that accountability is significant, and it's particular. And the coefficient, this is a 1 to 5 accountability index, and the coefficient for test scores is for one increase of 1 in the accountability for African Americans. This is all mother's education levels, because there are just too many states when you start getting down to very small sample size. So doing this, you find that you get 2 points for 1 accountability level. So if you go from 2 to 5, 3, you get a 6-point increase. 6-point increase is a lot on an 8 for this group. So I'm not saying that this is not a causal analysis. This is just correlational. Keep in mind also the child poverty rate has a negative effect. By the way, one of the stronger predictors of accountability in a state, do you have any idea what it is the child poverty rate, or the percent of blacks and Hispanics in the state. So the more blacks and Hispanics the state has, the more likely they're going to have a high accountability index. And you might ask yourself why that's true. Okay. From the very beginning, the origins in Texas, it had to do with financial redistribution. So as long as suburban Dallas districts were getting all this money, nobody was tested. As soon as black and Hispanic started getting the money, everybody was tested. That's the way, I mean, honestly, that's what happened historically. That's the reason they put in the accountability system, because they decided to redistribute the money, even though they were just one lawsuit after another is being brought against them, even though they had won in the Supreme Court in San Antonio versus Rodriguez. Various groups were constantly suing the state and winning, by the way, in district courts. Okay, some closing remarks. We can't say at this time with any certainty why students in California tend to score lower than students with similar family academic resources in other large states, and lower than similar students in a number of other states. California's advantaged students seem to do relatively better than its disadvantaged students compared to counterparts in other states. This may be a good sign, because a number of factors may affect the measured scores of disadvantaged students, factors that are not associated with school effectiveness, such as the rate of exclusion from the NAEP test, immigrant status, etc. On the other hand, lower student performance in California may reflect worse state and district organization, lower quality teachers because of lower real salaries, because of the high cost of living here, and the salaries are not commensurate with that high cost of living. And although California continues to make gains, particularly in the last 10 years, its students perform less well on the NAEP and the TIMS compared to similar students in high-performing states.
You've seen, there's 2 pieces that you didn't talk about, maybe they're not relevant, but one is the curricular alignment of NAEP protocols to the state's academic content standards. And we know that they've changed a lot. For example, in California, 75% of our kids in 13 took algebra in 8th grade. The NAEP test only is about 20% of it. So there are other curricular alignment.
But TIMS is higher on the algebra, and we did badly on the TIMS too.
Yeah, but I understand that. I'm talking about the NAEP. Second piece is, how is, you presume each state's actions in picking a sample that's reflective are similar. And with the lack of data systems in many states and the weak data system in California, has anybody investigated whether the selection process has multiple biases in it?
You mean in terms of they just don't have good enough demographic school data to pick a good sample? It's an interesting question.
I don't know.
You do count on the people to, I mean, the data,
Since my office prepares the files for that, I would say they're very accurate in fact. The data that
I
we
know you-
provide is the data.
That was
we
for
provide
years,
data.
and they were wrong for years, so, okay.
well, I mean, we have the school and staffing survey. We have basically a school census. So the question is, how accurate is the school census? Now, there are other issues, such as of kids changing schools. There's a high percentage of kids change schools in all the states, by the way. And so you may ask, you would think that in states where they change schools more often, that they're going to do worse. I mean, it has nothing to do with the curriculum. In states, I mean, I'm not telling you that I know the reasons for this, but I can tell you this. It's a very under-researched topic. And the reason it's under-researched, in part, I confronted the head of IES, the Institute of Educational Sciences, on this, and I said, all you're concerned about and all you fund is these little what works things, you know, and you've kind of missed the forest. The forest is that we've made huge gains on all but the PISA test over the past 10 years. The NAEP and the TIMSS, which are related to each other, those curricular-based tests have made big gains, particularly in mathematics. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows why, and we don't know why there's such high variation between states, even when you make these corrections. Now, either maybe the corrections aren't complete, if we had better correcting methods. We're going to use now the individual NAEP data to make more finer corrections, and we're going to try to get down to see if when you really, you know, exhaust all the differences that are not school differences that you can find in the NAEP individual student-based samples, if you exhaust all that, do you still have these differences? I predict you'll still have these differences. I mean, the fact is that when you compare Massachusetts and Connecticut, yeah, there are differences between Massachusetts and Connecticut in the demographics. There are some differences, but the average social class in Massachusetts and Connecticut is about the same. Very high percentage of college-educated people in those two states. On the TIMSS, on the NAEP, big differences in test scores. Now, maybe one curriculum is not aligned with those tests and the other one is. Maybe true. I don't think that will be the main explainer. There's something about the state organization, as it reflects on the schools. They started out the same in the 1990s, even as late as 99. On the TIMSS, they were the same. All of a sudden, they're not the same. What happened in the last 10 years? Something happened. We don't know what happened. We don't know what happened between those two states. Neighbors. So I don't think we've really figured out, lots of stuff has been done on California versus Texas, but nobody's really gotten down and tried to understand what the two things are.
There's one factor, because I was bothered by this for years, this Texas.
I bet you couldn't
doing
sleep.
better. And yeah, I couldn't sleep, it was awful. But in doing the investigation, one of the things that I was looking at in the NAEP data was the level of training of the math teachers. And it turns out that in Texas, elementary school math teachers are required to take college math. They're required to have a college algebra course or some sort of course. And we, to my knowledge, still do not have that requirement in California. So you seem to you know, see that there may be a teacher credentialing impact there.
Yeah.
That was the only thing that I could find really that was very useful. And many times things we thought useful, it started to look worse when you started to correct.
Well, they also have put an enormous, much more emphasis on doing well on tests. I think despite, you know, California has the standards, California has a test, California has an exit test, all of these things. But in Texas, it's a fetish. You know, they really find, if a principal doesn't score 2 years in a row, doesn't make the gains on all the groups, by the way, the principal is fired automatically. No appeal. So there's a real, I've interviewed in Texas high schools, a lot of Texas high schools, And they are obsessed by this, and they take the kids who are near the margin, they take the kids near the margin and put them in special classes where they just test drill them. And this is even in magnet schools, because they become like charter schools, that they just drill to the test. And because in some sense, their funding depends on it. So I think that probably has some effect. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is another story. I mean, these test scores, I don't want to use these test scores to say, oh, state X is better than state Y. But I do want to see if there are some real educational differences between the states that contribute to this. Something that is not just about drilling to the test, but is about really is there something about the organizations of these states and the way they work on education that can be carried over from state to state?
One of the takeaways I got is that the test score differences across states are still there even when you're comparing similar students. But I just want to be sure that I heard you correctly earlier that the test scores are also that the test score differences are also meaningfully reduced when you look at similar students.
Absolutely. So if I did a very rough calculation, you could see with Massachusetts. So if we look like Massachusetts, I mean, without picking up any of the sort of extra stuff of having 70% of your parents have college education, college complete, which is what they're showing. Wasn't it 68 or, the report is 68%. It's not that high really, but in the sample, when you exclude the people who didn't answer, it's that high. Versus 40% in California. There's externalities from that. I mean, the school system might look completely different when you just have that many college graduates of parents in your population versus not. You just have a different school system, probably. You can do things that are very different. But excluding that, if you just do this table and multiply by the test, we would move up about 8 points, which would throw us from 42nd to about the middle, 25th. That's extreme. If it put us in national average, it's only about 4 points, which would put us around 37th instead of 40. What are we, 42nd? 45th. 45th to 37th, and then 45th to about a big jump if we were like Massachusetts. So that tells you sort of what it is greatly reduced. And by the way, it's also greatly compressed if you do it. You lift the bottoms look a lot more like the top. So the whole thing is compressed.
Now, I'd like to ask you about your methodology a little bit more, because you said you excluded the data for those students that you weren't able to account for their mother's education.
I just did the percentage. No, just on the percentages.
Well, so, if
Oh yeah, I'm just comparing. Yeah, those people that didn't answer.
So if they did not answer, so if
They're not
there was a
included.
higher proportion of, maybe higher educated students were pulled out, I wonder how you maybe
Well, look, these are people.
account for that, as well as the fact that NAEP is a survey, it's not a census. So how did you make it an account?
Well, I'm not doing a regression analysis here. What I'm saying, so you're asking, so if I took my people who answered that their mother's education was high school or less, right? And now we know that on average 15 to 20% of people didn't even answer the mother's education question, right?
Well, let's just say it's a higher percentage in California.
There are extremes, but most of them around 15 to 20. They're all about, in these 5 states, all the missing answer about 15 to 20, but that's not the issue. The issue is, who are those people that don't answer the question? As far as you're concerned, that should be the question. Because if those people, if their scores are considerably lower, for example, in one state than another, how does that affect? And they happen to be people whose parents were mother. If they're spread out across all the groups,
You're making that assumption.
no, they're spread. What? Yeah, I am making that assumption. Yeah,
Spread evenly
yeah.
across
You know
all-
something? It's not. It doesn't change that much.
Well,
I can do it. I can do it.
The data tool lets you do that.
What?
You can do that, right?
Yeah, I can do it. I can do it if I were running regression. I can do anything I want. I didn't do it that way. I just calculated.
It makes it difficult.
Yeah.
But you
It's
can't,
not gonna make a difference between Texas. It might make small differences that'll make it more equal or less, but it's not gonna change the Texas, California scores, I guarantee you that.
but those crosstabs are available now. You can do those in the NAEP data tool, you know, ethnicity by response categories.
I have those, yeah.
I'm having trouble with the numbers, because I look at the eight numbers, the eighth grade reading, California is.
2013,
Huh?
276, yeah. Eighth grade math.
On eighth grade reading, we're 4 points below the national average.
Yeah, and we are 7 points below eighth grade math, yeah.
We're 8 points below.
Right.
Which is about 1.8%. So that.
What was it, what is it, 1.8%? Oh, percent?
The percent difference.
Oh, no, but, no, the 8 points is about a fourth of a standard deviation.
Perhaps so, but as percentage-wise, it's just the error of the test itself.
No,
It
no,
was off by 2%, you'd be even.
if the standard error,
You know, if you say plus or minus 3%,
Your margin of error.
the margin of error seems to be explained. So yes, we're below the national average, I agree with that. A lot of reasons for it, a lot of them are our own fault.
yeah.
But it's not that big anymore. It is closing the gap over time, points and percents.
We have closed the gap with the national average, that's correct.
Right.
That is correct.
And so.
No, but that was my point was that as far as these other big states are concerned, our scores do not differ from those other big states except for Texas. So we had a lower rise in the early period than they did, and we have had the later rise has caught us up.
But the press headlines that say California is way below average and things are coming to hell in the basket, the fact is we're almost average.
Yes, we are almost.
Good, but it's what we are.
Well, the more important thing, I think, is that once you correct for the difference between us and on a socioeconomic basis, we get even closer. Okay, we do. I showed you that, right? You cut about half the difference between us and the national average. But I don't know if California wants to be the national average. I mean, is that what we want to be? I mean, remember who else is in the national average? I mean, there are a lot of states in the national average that we don't want to be like.
Point, we're doing a hell of a job.
I guess my biggest takeaway here is that the highest predictor is child poverty.
Well, it is a big predictor. Yes, you're absolutely right.
So, I mean, if we know its target then, we really do know what.
Absolutely. The fact that California has a much higher percentage of child poverty than the national average is something to be concerned about. All I'm trying to tell you is that when the takeaway you should have is a lot of it is not schools and some of it is schools. Not necessarily schools themselves, but there's something about the organization that is different from those states that are scoring very high. Very high. Not the national average, but the ones who are scoring very high. So I think that's the takeaway. I'm not worried about the national average. I'm concerned is if you want to talk about, is California doing terribly? Not nearly as badly as people say, right? But on the other hand, you shouldn't walk away and say, oh, the entire problem is social class or race ethnic distribution. That isn't the entire problem. If you want to compare yourself with the high scoring states, if that's what you want to compare. Now, what you do about that difference, I can't tell you yet, but it should be something of great interest. We should also be very interested in is how to solve the problem of child poverty. In fact, that'll get us probably half the distance to where we want to go.
Do you have a sense of whether these differences, like for example, between California and Texas, persist when it comes to post-secondary completion? So I guess I care less about the gap if students are, if college completion rates are more similar to what's going on in Texas. But I'm
Well,
wondering if you have a sense
my
of-
previous NAEP paper from 6 or 7 years ago addressed this issue. And I just addressed it as far as Latinos were concerned. There are many people who disagreed with what I said, but I felt that the existence, California has put enormous emphasis, at least until 2000, on the expansion of the community college system. So even today, I think we have about twice as many community college students as we do four-year college students. So I argued in this paper that that was one of the contributors, not the only one, but one of the contributors to the fact that Texas actually had more Latinos going to, a higher percentage of Latinos going to four-year colleges than California. Because it was sort of, the famous line of, what was it called, what they said about community college, that it was
Cooling out.
the cooling out process, right? Burton Clark, wasn't it Burton Clark? Yeah, the cooling out process. So that it was a way of cooling out Latinos or shunting them into remedial education, and then they have so many years of remedial education required that they don't finish. So, I mean, I don't know what to do politically about it, because we have the community college system. But Texas has a much smaller community college system, and on the other hand, they have entire campuses of the University of Texas, I have 3 of them, which are 90% Latinos. Okay, whether those are just advanced community colleges or not, I mean, University of Texas at El Paso, Pan American, those are big campuses, and they're almost all Latinos. So the question is that a route to a college degree, a four-year college degree that's meaningful, versus, maybe completing to a community college? So you asked me a question about higher ed. Higher ed situation is complicated for us because, number one, we, first of all, have a relatively low percentage of college completers today, and it's going to get worse unless we do something. 50% of the kids now are Latinos in K to 12. If we don't do something about the higher ed system, I think we're going to be in trouble because they tend not to finish four-year colleges, despite building Merced, and despite having the highest percentage of Pell Grants and stuff at a state university of any state university in the country, at the University of California. But we do have an issue in higher education.
University of Texas is
What?
upper half of your high school graduating classes for the four-year colleges in Texas. Up the rule in Texas is.
Top 10% get guaranteed University of Texas, yeah.
But half are eligible for four-year universities in the public.
From their
High school graduates.
right. So maybe a lower scoring
We go
kid.
the upper third.
Yeah.
So we take that other group and shift them plus some.
Right,
That's
exactly.
back to that loop we say called it.
Right. So the question is whether the community colleges act as cooling out, and actually that we lose a number of people that could have completed four-year colleges but don't because of that. So that's the issue.
I have another question about, and I get back to Jeff's point. The cost of living in California is much higher
Right.
than Texas.
Yes.
So have you considered that as maybe, if you were to look at the child poverty rate, like what would it really be if you were to compare California and Texas? The number of students that would be at the same sort of income level, if you will, if you were to compare that?
I imagine that the child poverty rate is higher in Texas than here. You're absolutely right. My colleagues at Stanford in the poverty lab did a study of California, a recent study of California, which you can look up on the Stanford web, in which they show that because of the cost of living, we have a higher child poverty rate than is measured. Okay, so they did that. Now, you should do the same thing for Texas. You're absolutely right. You should do the child poverty rate relative to the cost of living. So, because that's poverty measured in terms of what you can buy. The question is whether child poverty rate is even higher in California than it is in Texas because of that. It might be, But, yeah, it might be.
On the states that you've shown here to illustrate where California is, have you also done the correlation of how much money is behind each kid on average in each of these states?
Yes, I've looked at, that was one of my variables. It does not show up to be significant. It's positive, but not significant. But that doesn't mean that it isn't significant. I ran a very rough, I just used the average spending per student. You might want to use instructional costs. I mean, there are lots of different things you can use. I just, ran just a very rough thing. For yeah, it doesn't show up for any of the groups.
So the next step, if anyone were to pursue it, would be some kind of qualitative analysis of Texas and California comparing them?
Yeah, the next step we're going to do is to use the individual data to see if we can get better stuff, better sort of social class measures, more accurate social class and race ethnicity is okay, but more accurate social class measures so that we can say, are we really taking out everything but something that we don't know about? And once we do that, then I think it's time for qualitative studies.
So you wound up not using books in the home?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. It's very simple. NAEP measures books in the home with enough differences. They stop at 100 plus, but at least you can differentiate at the bottom, starting only in 2003, and I wanted to go back to 1990.
And then you also didn't explicitly bring in the proportion ELs. Why didn't you do that?
I didn't do it because I could only use the NAEP tool on this, and I would have gotten into such. I actually did it by sub. I really boiled it. I took two parameters, and created groups within both race and parents, mother's academic resources, family academic resources. If I started doing, I wanted to show you graphs. I didn't want to run regressions. With the individual data, we will do ELL, and other things too, because there are lots of variables in there.
Yeah, I've worked with the imputed data sets, and,
Yeah.
and there's more that definitely that you can do than
Yeah,
the tool
I know.
allows you to do.
Believe me, I know.
But for the Hispanic population, both of those, factors, whether you have children, the indicator of SES and the EL,
Right.
the proportions vary wildly between these states.
Right.
So you've looked at Texas, you've visited Texas and many other states, other countries, and we understand the methodological problems that you've already identified and so on. So out of all that, do you have a hunch about what might make the difference between Texas and California? A hunch is just a hunch.
Well, I think the point about aligning the task, I don't think the text, by the way, I don't think the task is very well aligned with the NAEP either. They've made some changes over time, but the task is a lot easier than the NAEP. They're getting 90% proficient in some place, but I think it's less that there's some effect. I think there's some effect for putting tremendous emphasis on actually scoring high on the tests, particularly for the lower groups. It's harder to understand why Texas does better than we do and has done consistently better than we do with whites who report that their mothers are college graduates. It's hard to explain that.
So no hunch.
I only have a hunch that they have put much more emphasis on actually doing better. And I think they're, I don't think that the state administration is particularly better organized than California, but their emphasis on implementing, really forcing school districts and forcing schools to conform and their ability to sort of really put the sanctions on, I think it had an early effect. Now, what happened in California is that California, it parallels, I can show you the graph. It's interesting that it parallels the so you can see that starting in about 2003, we begin to look, or even 2000, their growth rate jumped there, but in overall, we look a lot more than, well, maybe that's not true, but not for this group. It certainly is true for the lower group, I think. Yeah, in the lower group, you can see that their big gains in the lower SES group, their big gains were early on compared to us. And before 2000, they just leaped. And then after that, it's a little bit more parallel. So they first of all instituted this stuff in the 80s. And they were one of the early states, North Carolina and Texas, to implement accountability. And so it made sense that the kind of accountability system they had would affect the lower social class groups more than the higher social class groups. We do better. Our gains are bigger for the higher social class groups than even Texas over this period. We're still below them, but our gains for the higher social class groups are bigger for the entire period than Texas. So there's something about their system, and it might be the emphasis just boom, 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 test, 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 and push, 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 but particularly early on, that got those lower groups up relative to what they were doing before, and they just maintain that difference.
Can you just remind us again what your definition of the strong accountability and the weak accountability?
Yeah, we had 5 measures. CPRI, the Consortium for Policy Research and Education, which is located now at the University of Pennsylvania, I guess it always was, they actually called around. We were working with CPRI at that time, and they called around to all the states and did long interviews to find out what they were doing in terms of accountability. And they had a whole long questionnaire. So from that, we took 5 measures. I remember that they had to do with how often if they tested in all the grades, if they had sanctions associated with the test, a degree of sanctions, and whether they had a high school exit test. So that if you had all of those things, there were 5 of them, that would constitute strong accountability. So you had states like Nebraska, Iowa, I forget, there are quite a number of them, about 6 or 7, that even in 2000 rated 1, which means that they basically, all they had was a test, a sort of a benchmark test. That's all they did. They didn't use it for anything, so Iowa had the famous Iowa State test. What is it called? Yeah, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. And that's the only test they had, Nebraska too. Well, those states have they're high scoring because they're high percentage white, college graduates, farmers. Anyway, they're flat. The scores are practically flat over this period, and but they're high. So that's.
Is California weak or strong?
California made the big change in about '98.
Just strong.
It moved up to a 4. It never got up to a 5 because the sanctions. The sanctions are less. Massachusetts put in the whatever they call the Massachusetts test, which they take pretty seriously. Massachusetts has. I mean, a lot of people say, like Susan Hawksby, that the smaller your school districts, etc. But that's been shown to be false. But anyway, so southern states it's driven by southern states that have county-wide school districts, so they have these very large geographic school districts with quite heterogeneous. And Massachusetts has these lots and lots of little school districts, quite homogeneous. So they're certainly not more autonomous, I can tell you that. I mean, in theory they're more autonomous, but the government of Massachusetts is a pretty heavy-handed operator there.
I want to thank you all for coming, and thank Martin very much and he will be around for a few minutes if you have questions that we didn't get to. But thanks once again.